Guten Morgen bei Taste of Science. Es geht weiter im Programm. Wir haben den ersten Programmpunkt heute mit einem Stargast aus London, möchte ich sagen. Miss Magdalena Skipper is based in London and she's streaming from London, and we're glad to have her here. She is a geneticist with a PhD from Cambridge University, chief editor at Nature, the renowned science magazine, and she is giving us some insights in science publishing and the role of science publishing in the time of a pandemic. Welcome, Ms. Magdalena Skipper, and we're glad to have you here.
Hello, good morning. It's my great pleasure to be with you this morning. It's a real pleasure to have this opportunity today to talk to you about the extraordinary events and experience that we've all had this year in 2020, but specifically focusing on science and its communication. At no other time in my life or in my professional career have I witnessed anything even remotely approaching the spotlight, the intensity of attention that science and its communication have been under. And what I want to discuss with you today is how this pressure and the opportunity have changed science and its communication, how they have influenced it. So let me start with a very British image. I am based in London, that's where I live, and that's where I'm speaking to you from today. Throughout the summer, or the spring I should say, and then to some extent the summer, we here in Britain were faced essentially on a daily basis with this image, previously unprecedented. Of course, what I'm showing you here is in the center, Boris Johnson, Prime Minister of the UK, and on either side of him is the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Advisor, respectively Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance. And so this tight linkage of science reporting on public health and scientific developments, together with political and policy statements, I, as I say, don't remember seeing this before in my life. Unprecedented responsibility and unprecedented opportunity for science to showcase to the whole community, broadest possible community and audience, how science works, on what basis scientists make conclusions, and how those conclusions can affect truly on a daily basis policy making as the situation unfolded in the pandemic this year. And indeed, it wasn't just those presentations from politicians and scientists side by side, and of course, not just in the UK, but all of us, regardless of where we live and what language we speak, we have seen on a daily basis headlines in newspapers. Here's just a pretty random selection of headlines, mainly, of course, from English-speaking press, but both from the US and the UK, showcasing you a range of topics, looking at pressures that hospitals were under, looking at pressures that universities and whole education system came under, that individuals came under, scientists came under, how treatments and interventions were unfolding, and so on and so forth. Of course, what I'm also signaling to you here is that it hasn't just been the coverage in the general press, but of course on social media. Social media which evolves and reacts much more rapidly than any newspaper or any news bulletin can, in a very different way, sometimes unfortunately in a very knee-jerk reaction. And we have seen an unfortunate rise of misinformation and misinterpretation of facts very quickly escalating and reaching very large audiences, something which, of course, I hope you would expect me to say is damaging, especially in the time of a pandemic. One thing which has been really gratifying to see over the course of this year is indeed how the social media, such as Twitter and Facebook, have finally come up to take on and realize their responsibilities. If you come to post or share any information relating to COVID-19 or the coronavirus that underlies the disease today, you will see a sort of warning sign come up to really make you reflect, is this the kind of information you want to share? Because of course, by sharing, you take on part of the responsibility. And in emphasizing to you the deluge of information, the coverage, which many of you in the audience here have experienced as readers, as recipients of this information, I would like you to think for a moment what it has been like for journalists and for reporters. The pressure to report on the pandemic in its many aspects has been so tremendous that, of course, many of these reporters, many of these journalists found themselves reporting on these topics in a situation where they don't really have a science or medical background. It's a very complex, rapidly evolving situation, which they themselves were expected to navigate, not necessarily with a lot of support. And this is a theme I will develop during this presentation this morning. But before I move in to talk about it in further detail, let me just give you a sense of the scale of what we're talking about here. So just the other day, literally a few days ago, I decided to take a look how many publications, news pieces, appeared to date this year with the words coronavirus and COVID in publications such as the New York Times and the Zeitung Online. So as a reminder, when I actually did that search, this was right at the end of November, this was the 333rd day of the year. In that time, in the New York Times alone, over 23,000 pieces, news pieces were published with the word coronavirus, and almost 17,000 pieces with the word COVID in it. In Zeitung Online, the number's a little bit smaller. The publication publishes fewer news pieces overall. But as you can see, it's a substantial amount, 3,500 with COVID containing the word COVID, and 5,500 containing coronavirus. So this is really enormous scale, true deluge of coverage of this truly life-changing event that has dominated our attention throughout this year. And as I said already, this has been a real challenge for the journalists. It has been a challenge to us to sift through this veritable waterfall of information. But let's not forget the reporters. Of course, it has also been a challenge for scientists themselves, many of whom, certainly not on a daily basis, are they used to talking to researchers and reporters. And so I'm illustrating this with a tweet from a researcher based here in London, in London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Adam Kucharski, whose tweet very nicely illustrates how results of a study can be easily misinterpreted in a headline, in a piece, even if that piece is contributed by a researcher. What you may not know is that the headlines will be altered, will be written by a news editor and the editor of the piece. So the conclusion in the headline, which says landmark Danish study shows face masks have no significant effect. In fact, that conclusion cannot be made on the basis of the study, which this particular news piece reports. And as Adam explains here in the tweet, the study was designed in such a way, it was looking for such a large effect. So in this case, 50% reduction in infection risk, that the fact that it didn't see a statistical result does not mean that face masks don't offer any protection. They don't offer significant protection in the context of the study. It's such an interesting illustration of the complexity of the issue that we deal with, of how careful we as consumers of this type of information have to be when we read headlines and read conclusions. Because of course, science is complex. Science is made or conclusions, scientific conclusions, are made in the context of complex and nuanced settings. This is something that I think many scientists, many researchers, many clinicians working in this sphere, although of course they're very aware of how their science unfolds and how the research unfolds, have become even more aware, even more sensitive to over the course of this year. So this careful and balanced reporting is absolutely essential so as not to jump to conclusion and misreport on what has been found. For this reason also, it's been incredibly important that up-to-date data on COVID-19 and anything to do with this coronavirus strain have been available to the general public and indeed to journalists. Here, what I'm showing you is a page from WHO's website. If you don't already visit this website on a regular basis, then I certainly very much recommend that you do so. It's an interactive map which allows you to explore how the situation with COVID-19 is evolving in different parts of the world. WHO, of course, an expert in infectious diseases, expert body in epidemics and now pandemic, has access to global data on how COVID-19 is evolving. What are the number of cases, the number of deaths, and there is further more and more information in a much more granular way. This is a site which I personally visit very frequently, and I know of many reporters, including our own reporters at Nature, would use this site as a basis of information. Another incredibly useful interactive source of information, which essentially portrays through this graphical interface the same data as WHO's, is this site here. This is the New York Times site, which again shows you a map. Of course, they decided to choose different colors. At a glance, you can see the intensity of infections, which parts of the world are struggling more with COVID-19, but also you can see on the graph below, the sort of yellow, green, and purple graph, you can see superimposed over time the dynamic of infection in different parts of the world, in this case, mainly by continent or certainly region in the world. Absolutely invaluable information, accessible to us all without any barriers to online access. I have certainly been, again, using these websites over and over again to see how real data is fed and updated on a global scale. So as I mentioned already, science and science communication have been affected enormously during this year. And there are three prevailing, most important prevailing differences. Science has become more open than ever before. It has become more transparent than ever before. And it has become faster, both in terms of how it's conducted, but very importantly, how these results are disseminated. So let me illustrate this with a few examples. Here, analogous to what I showed you with the news pieces in the New York Times and sites online, now I'm showing you the original scientific publications output during this year in 2020. So over 44,000, almost 45,000 is the number of scientific publications with the word COVID in the title that have been published across all different scientific journals. Almost 10,000 editorial pieces, so opinion style pieces have been published. Over 4,000 reviews, so broad overarching pieces which situate the current status quo in a broader context of scientific knowledge, maybe infectious diseases, maybe public health. Here, from amongst these, almost 8,000 number of scientific publications with the word coronavirus in the title. Some almost 7,000 have SARS-CoV-2, which of course is the scientific name for this particular coronavirus strain, in the title. And then almost 11,000 of preprints with either COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 within that text. So for those of you who are not familiar with what preprint is, it's essentially a ready scientific publication before it's been vetted by experts in the field. So when a scientific paper is published in a scientific journal, of course, it has been reviewed by experts in the field and appropriately revised. Preprints are an increasingly popular way of disseminating this ready, completed study in a form of, if you like, a mature draft of a scientific paper, but before it's been vetted by these experts, as I said. And preprint deposition and sharing has been an important tool for rapid dissemination of information. And of course, at a time of a pandemic, speed is of the essence. So 2 points to illustrate further. The 2 graphs on the right-hand side of the slide give you a sense of how the rapid increase, really almost exponential increase of sharing of these preprints this year. So on both graphs, what you see in orange is the number of COVID-related preprints that were deposited on 2 different websites that are essentially preprint repositories. The graph at the bottom is showing you a site which specializes in showcasing preprints in the medical and clinical sphere. The site is called Med Archive for these very reasons. You can see this enormous increase in preprints specifically around COVID-19. So that illustrates to you that the research community has really turned its attention to studying all different aspects of COVID and this particular coronavirus outbreak. What I'm also signaling to you is the importance of data sharing. So it's not just the sharing of the papers, the stories that are written up with conclusions and details of analyses, but also the data themselves, so that others in the research community, in the policy-making sphere, can look at the data, can evaluate themselves and build on these data. After all, this is how research progresses. Like in many other fields, scientists stand on the shoulders of others. And again, in no other time, to the extent that it matters in the pandemic time, it's so important that these data are open, accessible, and can be shared by others and built upon. I want to acknowledge the role of World Health Organization, which has really galvanized the whole scientific community very early on in 2020 towards sharing data as well as preprints and scientific papers. Several times already, I emphasized the importance for speed. And of course, when one considers evaluation of research output, one cannot compromise on quality of that evaluation and rigor and the integrity with which research is done. But at the same time, the evaluation needs to be rapid because reliable research results need to be available quickly. And of course, that evaluation is done by the research community itself, by other experts in the field who devote their time and expertise. And you can see on this graph again, relative comparison of time, how long it takes for a non-COVID-19 related scientific paper to go through peer review, and the numbers here are in days, as compared to papers that focus on COVID-19. So it's almost halved, that time is almost halved on average. Really incredible effort from the scientific community to be so dedicated to enable that very rapid and rigorous, at the same time, dissemination of scientific information and scientific results. And to give you a comparison, which is particularly illustrative, in my opinion, I wanted to share with you information about historic outbreaks of infectious diseases. So in this case, there were, of course, not pandemics, there were epidemics, they were more localized. But to me, this is such an illustrative example. So today, this year, we've seen some half of all scientific papers being shared on preprint servers, as these preprints that I mentioned a second ago. If we go back in time to the 2014 Ebola outbreak and the 2015 Zika outbreaks, only something like 5% of published papers were at that time shared as preprints first, enabling that rapid dissemination. When we go back all the way to 2003 for the SARS outbreak, there, the vast majority, 90%, almost 90, in fact, more than 90% of publications, so these are now peer-reviewed papers on this topic, were actually published once the outbreak ended. This is really significant because, of course, if you think about in terms of policy making, decision making, in terms of public health on the ground when an epidemic is unfolding, this decision at the time of SARS was being made on anecdotal evidence, not necessarily informed by scientific information, which came so much later. And I would argue that it's only thanks to this incredible emphasis on data sharing, information sharing in an unrestricted way rapidly, that for the first time in history, we had an announcement just a couple of days ago of a vaccine being approved for a disease only 10 months after the research to devise this vaccine began. Ordinarily, similar vaccine development takes on the order of 10 years rather than 10 months. It really is historic and unprecedented. Crucial to this success, absolutely, has been the data sharing and the information sharing in the community. What's also crucial, and something that the research community has recognized very early on, is that sharing information in the form of preprints has to be accompanied with appropriate caution. As I just explained, it is only the published papers that have been evaluated sufficiently by the research community. And so in the box here is actually a quote from a New York Times piece written by two American scientists who call on the whole scientific community to make themselves available to reporters, to make themselves available on the timescales that the reporters work. Of course, a reporter, if they call a potential source of information, often they need that information today, within the next couple of hours, because they have to file the story. These are not the timelines that ordinarily researchers are used to working to, and it's important to see that they themselves have realized the importance of their role in supporting the researchers here. So what about the papers themselves in terms of how many they've been published and in terms of how much coverage of COVID-19 and coronavirus there has been in scientific specialist literature? And so to give you a comparison, I'm now returning to the exercise that you've seen already, but now looking at the pages of Nature and Science, both weekly multidisciplinary scientific publications. So in Nature, we have published almost 1,000 publications containing the word coronavirus, some over 500 news pieces, 45 editorials. And to give you a sense, we published, as I mentioned, once a week, and on average, we publish 2 editorials per week. So that gives you a sense that essentially in almost every issue this year, there has been an editorial that has something to do with the coronavirus. Again, almost 1,000 publications containing the word COVID in them. Very similar numbers for news and editorials, and very similar numbers of this in the Science magazine as well. We try to collect this information, again, making it accessible to whoever is interested. Of course, some of this information is specialist, by that token less accessible to the general audience who is not a specialist themselves. But certainly it's accessible in the sense that all of this information is available freely on our website. We have two collections. One is a collection of all of our news and opinion coverage relating to this topic, and the other is a collection of all of the original research which we publish. We deliberately put these collections together to make it easy for anyone who's interested, be they other researchers, reporters, or the general public, to have access to this information, incredibly important at a time like this. We go out of our way to track the information and report on the latest news. Here's one example. So of course in Nature, we have a sort of a magazine part of Nature, if you like, as well as publishing original research. We publish news pieces. We have dedicated reporters, science reporters who work for us on a daily basis. But what I'm showing you here is a screenshot of a news piece which is continuously updated with almost bullet point information on the latest summaries of key papers, as it says here. And the screenshot I took here is literally from just a couple of days ago, from 3rd of December. What we also do, and I hope at least some of you in the audience subscribe to this, what we call Nature Briefing. And so this is an email newsletter, which is emailed on a daily basis to our subscribers of this newsletter. It's entirely freely available to subscribe to. We cover in this Nature Briefing a whole array of topics. But this year, during the time of the pandemic, we have specifically focused on COVID-19. So for day after day, we have a specific box within the Nature Briefing dedicated to information that is important, both in terms of latest discoveries and how those discoveries can affect us, our treatment, prevention, mobility during this unprecedented year, but also indeed social aspects, behavioral, policy making, how our politicians are responding to the information that is emerging from scientists and clinicians. So we try to provide this information, but also interpret as much of it as possible. The year has really been unprecedented, as I said so many times, but without me saying it, you will of course appreciate it yourselves. One obvious illustration of it is that I am speaking to you from my home in London, as opposed to being with you there in person. There has been amazing progress made during this year, both in terms of the discoveries and applications in the healthcare systems, but also in terms of how researchers have worked together with journalists and other science communicators, and quite frankly, the general public. And it's also only because of this openness, because of this collaboration, that we have been able to all cheer for this first approval of vaccination against COVID-19. And of course, many others are sure to follow very shortly. There is a definite light in the end of this tunnel. We have learned so much during this year. And I believe that many of the lessons we learned about how science is done and how science is communicated will stay with us beyond this pandemic and will make both science and science communication better for us all. And so with this, I would like to, I was going to say I would like to finish, but there is one other thing I wanted to share with you, and that is a tweet which I noticed almost 2 months ago now from Gary Lineker. Those of you who are not football fans may not know who Gary Lineker is. He is a former England footballer, by some considered to be the most successful England striker and a former captain of the England squad. He tweeted this at the end of October. I think it's a wonderful tweet illustrating how we have all become much more scientifically literate. He said, "The only positive I can think of during this entire pandemic nightmare is that some of us may have learned to read a graph." I hope that's comforting. And so with this, I will leave you here and thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Skipper. We've had splendid insights into how science and science communication evolved and what lasting positive effects may evolve from the time of the crisis. We have to look at data in a new way and at scientific evidence in a new way as we learn as a society by the sheer availability of data, sometimes raw data even. So you initially stated that there's a lot of wrong information and misinformation, but also wrongly and misinterpreted information, which is a really different thing. And I would like to ask you as to whether you see, as in your role as a publishing house, whether you are feeling more responsibility to teach the interpretation part of this problematic thing, because it's not, I mean, the general public really is not as literate as it could be probably, because we see many movements across the globe really pulling in doubt scientific evidence and yeah, sort of misusing information also.
So I would answer, I think there are two parts to my answer. So the most direct answer to your question is absolutely. At Nature, we feel extremely responsible for accurate reporting, interpretation, providing context, both to the research community itself, because of course not everyone in the research community is an expert in virology or epidemiology or public health, but also to the wider interested audience. In fact, this is very much part of our mission, which dates back 151 years back to our very foundation. Our mission has always been twofold: to disseminate that original research findings, discoveries of researchers and scientists, but also to put them in a context, to bring them to the attention of the widest possible audience. So absolutely, this is our core mission throughout, regardless of the pandemic. But of course, pandemic brings, because of the urgency of this issue, brings it into a sharp relief, this responsibility of ours. The second part to your question that I'd like to address is, indeed, it's a challenge. There is an awful lot of information out there. For a non-expert, it is often hard to discern which is right, which is wrong, which is substantiated, which is simply fabricated. My general advice for dealing with this problem is to always look at the source of information. If the information comes from a reputable newspaper, from an interview with a researcher in the field, as opposed to a website from a person who doesn't seem to have any real credentials in that particular discipline, then that will guide you to what extent can you put trust and weighting to the piece of information that you're reading where.
Well, thank you, Ms. Skipper, for those brilliant insights and this stressing of how important it is to look closely at where information comes from and where it was processed and interpreted. And I think we've made a big step forward in educating ourselves and the societal need, met the societal need to deal with a lot of agility and trust also in scientific data through trustworthy sources and publishing, like through Nature. Well, thank you for joining us today at Taste of Science, at the program we've setting up with Springer and Nature at the Deutsch-Amerikanische Institut in Heidelberg, the German-American Institute. Have a very good time and stay safe and sound. Thank you very much, Ms. Skipper.
Thank you.